We're talking about a very, very interesting story that ended tragically, that involved this particular mill. The Howland Mill story is about a man with a vision that created something very special here for a very short amount of time, and that's going to be the essence of the walking tour. We're going to see the buildings that were built that were very modest but very historically important, as it turns out. But I wanted to start in here to just give a little history of what it was like to work in the mills, what the history of the textile mills in New Bedford was, and then we'll go and start the tour on Circuit Street. New Bedford was late in coming to the textile industry. As most of us know, Samuel Slater started the Industrial Revolution, really, in the United States when he set up his mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And all the early mills that were developed in Lowell and on the Blackstone River Valley in Rhode Island and so forth, they all were built around water power. They had a major running river nearby, and they harnessed that with those big wheels that you've seen probably in textbooks and so forth. Or if you've been to the Slater Mill, they actually operate one of the small mills with the water wheel still. And a tremendous industry developed here in New England. New Bedford didn't get involved in the textile industry early on for basically two reasons. One of them was the fact that they were making so much money whaling that they didn't really want to do anything else. And the other one was that they didn't have a water power source. But the technology of steam engines developed rapidly in the 1820s and 30s, and by the 1840s, gigantic steam engines were developed to run mills of this size. And after that, all the mills that were built after the 1830s and 40s were based on steam technology, and that's what New Bedford did as well. So the very first mill that was built in New Bedford was the Wamsutta successful mill. There were some small mills that failed, but the very first mill that was a very successful mill was the Wamsutta Mill. For those not familiar with the Wamsutta Mill, it's the big complex that's just to the east of Route 18 as you're coming in or out of the downtown area towards Route 195. And that was built and established in the late 1840s. It was very successful from day one, and it continued to grow until the whaling industry petered out, and all that capital that had been accumulated in New Bedford from the whaling industry started to be transferred to the textile industry. And there was really plenty of money to start the industry here. And by the 1880s, early 1880s, New Bedford experienced a boom in mill construction. They started north and south from where the Wamsutta is located now. There were mills built to the south, all on the waterfront, and to the north. And William D. Howland was one of the men that got involved in this business. I'll talk specifically about Howland in a minute. And he built this mill here, in this particular mill that we're standing in 1889. Now, so that's the history to that point. We were in the middle of a boom period, mill construction, mill production, and all cotton products for the most part. There were some dalliance in silk and wool, but primarily in New Bedford it was a cotton town. And the textile industry in New Bedford did two things very well and two things only. They got raw cotton, spun it into thread or yarn as they called it then in the early days, and then they wove that spun cotton into cloth. That's basically what the mills did. They didn't do any finishing, they didn't do any of the dyeing, they didn't do any of the other stuff. They made a basic product and it was sold to other people for the finishing. New Bedford never did any of that type of dyeing and so forth, which was done, was plenty of other places in Rhode Island, and even in Fall River did a lot of finishing as well. Now this mill here, as I mentioned outside to a few, all of the Howland mills were just spinning mills. They didn't do any weaving at all. Every inch of this particular floor, and the 3 floors in this building and the 3 floors in mill number 1, which I'll talk about when we go outside again, were filled with spinning machines. They took the raw cotton and processed it. It's a very complicated process, which I really quite don't understand yet, but they would it would go from these balls of cotton. Remember, cotton fiber is only 1.5 inches to 2 inches, sometimes only 1/2 inch to 2 inches long. And they come in this very tight by cotton balls that you can still buy. And that all had to be processed to make hundreds and hundreds of yards of thread. And by the time the 1880s came along, it was pretty much a standard procedure. But in this particular mill, and all the mills that were built during this time, no matter where they were built in the same manner. They had these long shafts. I don't think this is one of the original shafts. That's a water shaft. But the shaft was about that wide, the one right on top of this roof here. And a series of shafts would go, probably in this particular mill, there'd be 3 shafts. And on those shafts were connected to the steam engine, and those shafts rotated. They put leather belts on those shafts and connected them to the spinning machines or the looms, depending on what you use. But in this particular case, they were spinning machines. And that's what drove the machines. So every single one of the machines on this particular shaft, which would go on, there might have been 2 shafts. It probably might have been even just one. Well, probably this is a pretty long mill. Probably 2 shafts in this particular building. And when one of the machines went down for one reason or another, all of them went down. You had to stop the whole thing, and that's how it worked. And if you had to have a very good reason, and probably the individual operators of the machine, of probably a series of machines, could stop the whole line. But they did so at the overseer's extreme ire at the time. It was a very difficult job for the operatives, but that's what they did here. And as you can see, this mill has been really beautifully rehabbed and repurposed, really, for other reasons. And if you go into like the Acushnet River Antiques, which is pretty much the same as it was, and some of the old, if you've been in the Kilburn Mill during the time when the panorama, the Whaling Museum panorama was on display, you could see what it was really like. You know, none of the equipment's there anymore and so forth. But if you would see, when you do see pictures of the mills during those years, it's packed. You could not fit another inch of machinery in the floors here when they were in full operation.
I tried to count initially, and I was about 50. I was wrong. A lot. Yeah.
So I'm going to be yelling. The mill right behind us is mill number 1, built in 1888, actually. Just a year before the one we were in. It's a little bit, actually it's quite a bit smaller. It's about half the size of the one we were just in, but basically the same layout, the same products, the same everything. But this is where I want to introduce you to William D. Howland. William D. Howland was the mastermind of the project. He was born in 1853 here in New Bedford to 2 very, very important New Bedford residents. One of them was Matthew Howland, who was a very well-known and a successful whaling merchant, and his wife and William's mother was a lady by the name of Rachel Howland, one of my favorite people from New Bedford, actually. I talked about anybody who came to the tour last week. This is the same Rachel Howland that I talked about last week. She was a very, very important activist, social activists on a whole range of issues, mostly women's issues, but not exclusively so. She was a very well-known Quaker preacher. Both the Howlands were very strict Quakers. They did not leave the meeting when they had problems with the religion in the early parts of the 19th century. They were very strict Quakers, very, very successful. They spent a lot of money on philanthropy, setting up. They built a church for the mill people at the Wamsutter Mill. They did lots of good things. It was all led by Rachel. So that was his parents. One very, very interested in making money and adept at making money, and his mother, who was very, very socially conscious and acted upon those convictions. So kind of an interesting combination of maybe skills that he brought to this site. Howland went to the Friends Academy, graduated from Brown University in 1872. and started working. He decided, though, he wasn't going to follow in either one of his parents' footsteps. He was going to make his mark in textiles. He worked 5 years at the Wamsutta Mill learning the business. Then he took a year off and traveled around to see other mills and how they operated, and then decided to set up his own little cotton mill, which he did on land that his father owned at the foot of North Street. His father was a very successful whaling merchant. He had his own wharf at the foot of North Street, and he owned land on a few blocks up from North Street himself. And the whaling business of the Howlands took a very, very bad turn in the 1870s. In fact, they lost so much money in 2 successive disasters in the Arctic where they were whaling at the time that Matthew and Rachel really were living off their creditors' goodwill by the time the late 1870s came. So William was maybe doing a little bit of the family a favor by he bought the site on North Street, and he built a little mill called the New Bedford Manufacturing Association, New Bedford Manufacturing Company. And it was completed in 1882, and it was successful. He made some money. And the investors that he convinced to help him with the mill were some of the most important people in New Bedford, the Roach family and the Clifford family. Especially the Roaches. The Roaches still had a lot of money. William J. Roach was one of the wealthiest men in New Bedford, and he was the financial backing for the New Bedford Manufacturing Company. With that encouragement and the amount of money he was making, he decided to go on this grand scheme. And basically, without beating it to death, he bought 150 acres in this area of New Bedford. Basically, from Rivet Street to all the way to Dartmouth Street and down to Orchard Street as well, and even out to Cove, 150 acres of land. And he was going to build this massive industrial, residential property on it. But it was going to be a little bit different than your typical residential property. He was going to do his best job in creating housing and living environment for his workers as he possibly could. And that's what he tried to do here. And that's what we're going to see in a few minutes. All of these mills that were built, no matter where they were in New England, when you built a mill like this, you automatically had to provide housing for at least 100 to maybe 300 people right out of the box. They needed some place to live. They weren't close to areas where there was a lot of housing because they were all spread out in areas that were unoccupied. This particular section of New Bedford, when Howland bought it in 1886, was virtually empty. There was nothing out here but abandoned farms and nursery land. Bolton Street did exist, but nothing else existed out here. And the same thing with the new mill. So you always had to provide housing when you built a new mill. And the housing they built was usually of the poorest quality and even worse maintained. And he wanted to break that mold and develop something that would be pleasing and human to the workers in the mill. And that's what he did. And behind us is the Howland Mill Village. 25 houses built when this building was built, and another 25 houses when mill number 2 was built. Now, there's no way that everybody who worked in the mill could have lived in the houses because they had too many employees. That mill probably started out with 150 people, and that probably started out with 250 people, and there's no way that these houses could supply 500 units of living. They were single-family houses, but it was a good start. And there were plenty of people that they recruited to work in the mill from the area just south of Orchard Street and Rivet Street, so that's probably where the rest of the workers came from. So he built this great village, made it affordable. The village cost $100,000 to build, and the infrastructure for the village cost another $38,000 because they had running water, hot and cold running water. They had sewer systems. They had a few little roads. The 2 roads that we're going to see, we're going to walk on, they were built as well at the time. And they had to build a road at the back of the mill as well because the Jenkins Street did not exist. There was nothing there. Nothing existed at the time. The rents for the village were $8 for the 5-room cottages, $8 a month for the 5-room cottages, and $10 a month for the 7-room cottages. Now, you have to realize that the weekly rate wages at the mills were $5 a week to $15 a week. $5 a week for 56 hours. That's a standard work week at the mills. No matter where you went, that was the standard work week until World War II. 56 hours a week. 10 hours and 10 minutes a day, and 5 hours and 10 minutes on Saturday. But nonetheless, there was an equal distribution of the wage earners in the village. It was really revolutionary. People were really, this was a model mill housing at the time. It was written up in papers across the country, actually. And the city was very proud of it because, when there was strikes, and there were strikes constantly, and that was one thing that Howland wanted to avoid at all costs, was an adversarial relationship with the workers. So, this is how he tried to solve it. One of the reasons how he's going to solve the problems. You had to work for the mill to rent one of the properties. They took the rents out of your wages. You could sublet. You could sublet your house, actually. They allowed that. And they would also allow you to buy property because they owned, when we go to the end of the property, everything toward Dartmouth Street was owned by the corporation. It was vacant and stayed vacant for a long time. You could buy a lot and build your own house if you wanted to. They were very, very generous about housing and so forth. So that's what he did here. We're going to walk up right here in a minute. There are four distinct designs in the village. There was 15 5-room, you could tell probably by the size, which is the 5 rooms, and 35 7-rooms. There's 4 different styles. There's the traditional gable end. There's a jerkin head or clipped gable end. There's the gambrel end, and then there's the colonial gambrel, like a Cape style gambrel. And there's 3 of them in our very first start. This house right here is exactly like it looked in 1895. The government actually did a survey of mill housing in New England, and they did this project in spades, actually. And they drew a picture of one of the houses, and this is the one they didn't draw this exactly. But it looks just like this. The dormers are a little bit different on the ones, but the porch is the same. Everything's the same. So this house here, even though it looks brand new, kinda, this is what they look like. This is what it looked like when it was built.
You've done a nice job of keeping it up.
This one here also looks pretty much exactly the same as when it was built. This is called the jerkin head end or the clip gable end. There's quite a few of these on the 5-room size. The one across the street, the red one, that's the gable end. That's the 3rd of the styles. And the white one, you see the white one up the street here? That's the gambrel end. It's like intersecting gambrels. So they repeat. There's differences in each one of the houses. They're not all exactly the same. For instance, like some of the dormers have the clipped gable like this does in the front of the house. So there's a little bit of variation on many of them. And you can see they're somewhat randomly placed on the street to make it more like a park-like setting and less formal and less undesirable, as it were. But that's pretty much how they're set up. Yes?
How many families live in a place like this? How many people? One family?
One family. They had full basements, as I mentioned. They had most of the bathrooms on the second. They were nice little houses. They had full basements, concrete basements, hot and cold running water, and they were connected to the sewer system. This house here was called the tenement or boarding house for the mill. This was built as part of the village. Now, it wasn't always situated here, though. It was on the corner, along with 3 other houses, of the northeast corner. This was right on the corner of Rockdale and Bolton where we were. This was right on the corner. This was a tenement house or boarding house for the single male workers. Try as I may, I couldn't figure out how many people this house would actually hold, but probably at least 10 or 15. What would you say?
It had 9 apartments.
9 apartments?
Yeah.
All right, so 10 or 15 probably. It's been modified greatly. These 2 towers in the front are, I guess, I'm not sure what they're the stairwell, probably the stairwell now. But this house here was part of the village, but it was moved here probably around 1915. They built the next owners of the mill built the weave shed where the Ciabra is and so forth at that site. And I think they probably demolished the little houses because there's about 47 or 46 that still stand, and there's 3 or 4 missing. That probably lost 3 of those, but they did move the tenement house to this location. When you look at historic photos, there's a lot of historic photos of the site, and you can see this building is clearly the tenement building that was moved. It's been modified somewhat, but the design is very, very similar to the other houses in the village. And it looks like it's a little bit out of place here, but it actually is part of the village that was built in the first round of buildings in 1888. One of the things that Howland did for the employees was take them on an excursion to Martha's Vineyard every summer. He chartered a steamboat. Matter of fact, even in this article I told you about the 60,000 pounds, they also talked about this this benevolence of paying for chartering a steamer and bringing as many people as he could to Martha's Vineyard for an outing. And they had scheduled picnics and ball games and bicycle races and all kinds of things. Food. They even had a band on the ship so they could play music on their way out there. They identified the ship actually in the article. And it's a ship that you could find online. And it's a pretty big steamer. I don't think it would have held more than 300 or 400 people, but maybe more than that. But anyway, for 3 years running, actually 4 years running, he went on this he rented chartered a steamer, a huge steamer, like a 4-over-line boat. If anybody's ever seen a 4-over-line boat, one of those types of steamers, and he took everybody who wanted to go to Martha's Vineyard for the day. So what happened? Well, they built the third mill on this site called the Roach Spinning Mill, 1892. Everything was going great, making money, everybody was happy. But then in 1893, one of the cyclical recessions in American economic history took place called the Panic of 1893. All the recessions in the 19th century were called panics of something or other, the year that they happened. And they were about every 20 years. There was one in 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893. And what happened in these recessions is like what happens in all recessions. Like when we had the mortgage recession just a few years ago. People lose their jobs, people stop buying stuff, the economy goes south, everything is bad. And that's what happened here. The panic hit New Bedford. They decided to cut wages by 25%. Now, how they cut wages in the textile era was they actually reduced hours, reduced your opportunity to make product. They called it curtailment, cut down. And that's what they did. They proposed a 25% reduction in hours. And there was a resulting strike in 1894. Now, there was an association of mill owners called the New Bedford Manufacturers Association. And because all the mills basically were one mill as far as policy and price and wages and everything was concerned. It was the era of the interlocking directorate. So everybody was on everybody else's board. Everybody was on everybody else's bank board. It was a total control of the industry, meant for two reasons, control and risk avoidance. That's basically why. So, but the conflict of interest, of course, obviously, all of that has been outlawed now because of conflict of interest. But in those days, that didn't exist. And so the Manufacturers Association got together, declared the cut down, the workers went on strike. Now, William D. Howland wasn't at the meeting where the strike where the cut down was voted on. And so he held out. And he said, well, I'll close for, it was like a Wednesday or something like that. And he said, well, I'll close for the next couple of days. I'm going to think about it. And he decided that he wasn't going to close. He was going to continue the hours and wages and production that they had been doing. And they didn't sit well with everybody, but that's what happened. The problem with that strategy was the recession went on and on and on. He continued to pay high wages, and if you're paying high wages, or not high wages, the prevailing wage, you also have to pay dividends to the shareholders, because that's what they expect. You know, if you're paying them, we get money first, then they get money. So he continued to borrow secretly to keep the mill running, to keep his employees happy, and to perish, and also to pay the shareholders. Well, you can't do that forever. And the recession dragged on and on. By the time 1897 came along, he was desperate. He had to have been so desperate. He went to the bank, what he was a director, and his father had founded, and said, I need another $200,000. And they said, no way. And we want to see your books right away. Because there was, rumors that there was something up. And he knew at that point, he must have been under enormous pressure. He had a wife and 2 sons. And when he was declining the bill, he knew that the mill was going to fail. Not only was the mill going to fail, the bank was probably going to fail as well. He leaves the meeting with his accountant. The accountant sees that Howland is really distressed. He says, don't do anything rash. And Howland says, I won't. He walks to his dock at the foot of North Street and drowns himself. The mill fails. The bank fails the next year. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are lost. The estimates of how much he was in debt range from $500,000 to almost $1 million. They had assets of only like $100,000. The mill failed. The mill was taken over in receivership by the Bedford Manufacturers Association. They ran it for a couple years under those terms. A big giant holding corporation, which they got from out of town, came and bought the assets of the mill, looking for a buyer. And then the economy picked up in around 1900, 1901. The mill was sold to another organization, and they renamed it the Gosnold Mill. And it was very successful as the Gosnold Mill, actually. But the legacy of the benevolence was lost, unfortunately. And the thing is, if he had just been patient, if he'd gone with the cut down, and maybe he would have reduced rents or done anything else to keep the mill solvent, because if he had just waited until it turned around, they would have been rolling in the money again, because the high point and the real profitable time in New Bedford was just ahead. Thank you all for coming. Great job.